Let your phone set itself. Let your iPad set itself. Let all your devices set themselves. See if you can figure out the range. But, the one in the car, it can wait 6 months.
Okay, so we are here. Good morning, Art. I see you're here. Sorry we're running late this morning. I'm double timing because I'm going to take a praxis on reading on Tuesday, on election day. I'm going to be from noon on taking this reading praxis to see if I'm certified to teach reading in the public schools. This is the one where I had given Debbie my ID card, my driver's license, when I went in for my carpal tunnel surgery, and forgot to get it back in my wallet. And at the testing center, they refused to accept my military ID card or my passport. I had to come with my driver's license. And so, okay, so kiss that $156 goodbye.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so they didn't just reschedule? You have to repay?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
So, so anyway, we're on, and good morning, everyone. Out in YouTube land, we are continuing to read an article. I have to check the author. An article by Darian Pictet, who is a Jungian analyst in Switzerland. And you can see Darian on the European version of The Analyst and the Rabbi, in which in the U.S. version I played Dr. Jung, but Darian played the woman in the other play in the European version. And if you're wondering what t-shirt I'm wearing my Marine Corps t-shirt today, because right after this, I'm going to go get my hair cut in preparation for wearing my uniform to school on Veterans Day. Normally, I would wear it on the Marine Corps birthday, but since that's Sunday this year, I'm going to wear it on Veterans Day. And last year, that brought all kinds of approbations from my 13-year-olds who don't know what they're talking about. But anyway, I have to show the flag once a year.
Yeah, once a year, whether it needs it or not. It's kind of like
Yep.
spring cleaning.
Yep, that's right. Make sure it's not moth-eaten. So anyway, we're reading about the movements of the soul, and there are these archetypal women in men's minds. And so we're looking at Jung's mind as a European man more than 100 years ago, 100 years ago. And so this is what Darian has to say about Salome/Helen. So after the first encounters, and I'm sorry, I'm reading from this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, by Murray Stein and Thomas Arst, editors. And this is volume 1 of a 5-volume series. And so we're going through these essays to look at the Red Book from different perspectives and then bringing in our own perspective, such as it is. And so anyway, Salome/Helen. After the first encounters with soul that enabled him to accept the wounds that heroic patterns of behavior bestowed on his capacity for genuine relatedness, the narrative takes us to the mysterium encounter. In this scene, Jung meets soul in the form of Salome, who, in the biblical narrative, danced and delighted King Herod and his guests, but then requested and received the head of John the Baptist, the prophet who announced the coming of Jesus, the new God, the new awareness. This young girl who evoked the sensuality and erotic temptation that culminated in the beheading of a holy man fills Jung with horror. Yet he finds himself strangely attracted to her and discovers that she loves him and that this is significant. Must he love her too? Must he love his own desire? Salome stands for desire and pleasure, a force without form or definition. Elijah, the older man who accompanies her in this scene, stands for a function of mind Jung calls forethinking. Jung relates Salome and Elijah to Eros and Logos, and is told that these two principles have been together since the beginning of time. Elijah can see, but inhabits a dark place, whereas Salome is blind and inhabits a bright place. Elijah is forethinking, can see into the depths of the past and the future. In this encounter, Jung recognizes that thoughts are natural events that you do not possess and whose meaning you only imperfectly recognize. Freeing himself gradually from the activity of mind allows Salome, as wild desire, eventually to lead him to the depth of love. During this period, Jung began to elaborate his theory of psychological types, and later he wrote that the anima is also the personification of the inferior function, which relates a man to the collective unconscious. But when he first visited the bright garden of Salome, of pleasure, Jung had to realize that, being a thinking type, his feeling remained in darkness, blind and primitive, and so appeared disgusting to him. Quote, I recognized the father because I was a thinker, but thus I did not know the mother, but saw love in the guise of pleasure and called it pleasure, and therefore this was Salome to me. Now I learn that Mary is the mother, the innocent, unquote. This important differentiation between pleasure and love shows that the anima is now transforming his understanding of these two principles. Elijah tells him, quote, may the thinking person accept his pleasure and the feeling person accept his own thought. Otherwise, they are death to each other, just as John the Baptist found death at the hands of Salome. Clearly, thinking types fear Salome, as she wants their heads. As Jung came to accept that he desired Salome, he further integrated his feeling function and accepted pleasure as a dynamic force in nature. Soul is always close to embodiment. And in What Matters, Salome, as the serpent of temptation, points him to the mysteries of earth, sensuality, and erotic love. Jung's reference here to Mary, the mother, points to the next development of anima, as his capacity to relate to his inner figures developed. So Jung's relationships with women changed, and it was at this time that he began an involvement with Toni Wolff. Jung tells us, quote, I climbed down to my pleasure but ascended to my love. By sacrificing his highest function, thinking, he could develop a living relationship with his most primitive and unconscious function, feeling. By acknowledging pleasure and erotic impulses, he dethroned his thinking function from its lofty heights. This integration of darker, unknown aspects led to increasing consciousness. Quote, love is empty without thinking, thinking hollow without love. Love and forethinking are in one and the same place. Let me see how long this goes. All right, we'll stop there for a moment and let Jordan opine on this.
Well, I think the one thing I want to comment on is Salome usurps the head, John the Baptist's head, the prophet's head. And the head of a prophet is a feeling thinking thing. The head is integrated. I mean, because you talk about courage, you talk about naivete, you talk about wisdom. But in that sense, metaphorically, when she asked for the head of John the Baptist, I don't think she's fighting thinking. I think she's trying to receive feeling thinking or thinking feeling, because the prophet would be not a normal person. They're fully integrated, so you could take a cell off their fingernail and there's integration. So it's all throughout. So by taking the head, of course, there's the death. But I'm wondering if that's then the paradoxical usurping the thinking feeling head as a thought.
Righto. And of course, well, I want to ask you whether you regard this year's election campaign as sort of a replay of that battle.
No. I think on the surface, I should, from what I'm told and what I hear. But what I see is, I see a lot of irony of whatever's said. I just see a lot of, take a play out of Joseph Goebbels' playbook, lie and then blame the other people for what you just did. And it's both sides. And, for example, the red side will answer questions specifically and the right side will not, and the blue side will answer abstractly and not. But the questions themselves, it's like Jordan Peterson. It's like, no, I'm not going to answer that. I take issue with the way you phrase the question. So I would love to say, sure, we're in this archetypal time, age of Aquarius, but it's politics. And how do you know a politician's lying? Well, their mouth's moving. And so, I have to say, this is the first election where my skepticism just is across the board. And there's all this, oh my God, if the other party gets elected, the world's going to go to hell in a handbag. The world's always going to end tomorrow. And all this sensationalist, apocalyptic mumbo jumbo, I think people would like it to be, but I have a feeling that there's an ignorance presence that I can't equate with being unconscious. So I feel that there's a lot of strings on a lot of people being pulled from places that no one sees. And the same people are pulling both sides of the strings. So I would say no. I would love it theatrically to be yes, because that's what I see. But just like in literature, the primary theme is the irony of appearance versus reality. So I really see a lack of responsibility across the board. And I just cannot see to attribute any kind of credit to anything other than, well, maybe they're being led by these archetypal forces and they're unaware. But there's the lack of responsibility right there. Just because something else moved you, you're still responsible for your actions. So I just really have a hard time just in the last 5 days, um, sinking my teeth into we're playing the paradox. I see, yes, they're both sides have never been so differently fractured. I mean, if you look at Crossfire, the political talk show in the 80s, it was Republicans versus Democrats, Democrats versus Republican, and okay, that's fine. But there was still a little bit of a Lincoln Douglas actual debate kind of thing. I don't see any debate at all. And the interviews aren't that either. So I have a hard time attributing anything of any substantial value to what's going on in society other than a malady of 2.5 generations of parents letting the kids run the family, processed foods making people unhealthy and brain fogged. And I think the real piece is health. And I think it's not about politics. I think that's the suit that gets put on. And so my 4.5 cents from two. Um, I just I'd love to say yeah, but it feels like too much in the intellectual ivory tower academia to even entertain the folly of that, because I think it gives too much credit to how little people have um, responsible navigation of their own lives in play and are just led along. What's the lamb will live its life in fear of the wolf, only to be eaten by the shepherd. I mean, so I think the shepherd, and that to me, that says politics right there. That says everything I need to know. Which one's the lamb, which one's the wolf? Well, it's always them that's the wolf, and
Right.
us is the lamb. We're all, holier than thou, and that's spiritual elitism, which is just self-righteous. And as soon as I know I'm so correct, I better know that that's folly, because I mean, that's so. Anyway, I think really what I'm taking issue with is I can't make a statement without diagnosing society as a whole. And part of me just goes, clean the slate and step up, be an adult.
Yeah, make a decision.
Make a decision. Yeah, and because here's the thing, you're going to regret it if you do, and you're going to regret it if you don't. But if you made the decision with even an iota of a currency of value, okay, well, you're doing something. And there are no mistakes. If you're not making them, you're not doing anything. So then they're not really shameful mistakes. They're just course correction indicators. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm going to take the role of the prophet here, and I'll take the opposite
Cool.
point of view. Okay, I do concur that the world will not end. Okay, regardless of who's elected. And although I've heard many Republicans say how awful things have been in the last 4 years, um, they don't say how. They don't say how. And as I recall, the Obama administration was no drama Obama, and he was pretty much the quietest presidency we've had in my lifetime, and the clearest. I mean, when he finally did kill Osama bin Laden, um, it was quite matter of fact. He just said, "We did it, and it's over."
Mm-hmm.
And so I do see huge archetypal things in this. Um, and as most of the people on this channel probably know, I have been predicting a landslide for the Democrats for over 2 years now. And I'm completely unmoved moved by any suggestions that it won't be that. And the talking heads have their business in making us think that this is a razor edge election because they obviously make lots of money on political ads. And here in Maryland, even though the race for president is pretty clear, the race for the Senate is it's not clear. And we have the former governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, running on the Republican side and claiming that he, would not take away women's right to choose their own destiny. And we have Angela Alsobrooks, who, is speaking the normal Democratic line this year. And I will be surprised if Larry Hogan wins. But the ads, what I want to talk about is the ads. The ads have been coming one on top of another. I mean, I saw in one break in one television show, I think it was 5 ads, one after another. Alsobrooks, Hogan, Alsobrooks, Hogan, Alsobrooks, or vice versa. And that has been going on for weeks now. And so I'm not moved by any of that. I know what I feel, and I could be very wrong. I acknowledge I was wrong in 2016, and I could be very wrong again. So I hope that I'm not, but in any case, that is my prophecy. And everybody's focused on the so-called swing states. And oh my God, won't it be terrible if one of the swing states goes one way or the other? And I'm focused on the red states because I think that if we see one red state drop Democratic, it may be a sign of a landslide for the Democrats.
And
And I
that,
think we'll see that happen between 10 and 11 p.m. on Tuesday night.
well, I think now, you taking the profit piece there, I'll modify and extend what I said to come over to the other side and in agreement on the bigger picture to better answer, I think, the original question, then yes, we're playing out this archetypal drama. And with you putting Obama there, the calmness, Obama's presidency was the denouement, that plateau of slowing of the energy of the story to where now we're at the climax. And what's interesting is if one red goes blue, goes the other way. If one blue goes red, I think so. The razor's edge is that they who take care of the small things will be given much. It's not the swing states, the we won the lottery states.
Yeah.
It's all the rest of them. And in the bigger picture, then I think the climax is not so much political. It's in 1987, R.J. Reynolds bought Nabisco and bought General Mills and bought Kraft, I think. And in 1988, the other big tobacco bought the other big foods. And they sicked their addictive scientists on the foods. So we have seed oils and foods. Processed foods are not about nutrition, they're about addiction to get you into big meds and big pharma and then keep the circle going. So I really think the big picture is the brain fog in society that allows this to happen because people don't know how to step up and say, I do not comply, period.
Yeah.
And I'm not afraid. So I think we are in that place, but I think you're right on the money with, it's the kind of piece where one domino goes one way And well, do the other ones react and go the other way, or do the other ones react and fall the same way with it? So I kind of think there's this disconnected chaos of alleged order where some states will then turn against the other states and then, no, no, we're staying red or we're staying blue, and vice versa. So I think you're right. Between 10 and 11, we'll know more. And I think it's folly up until then to, I see all these people trying to bet on politics. And I think it's illegal in the United States, but I saw a bunch of people putting life savings on. And I thought, well, that's just dumb in the first place, much less politics. So I think the profit piece is interesting there because you then pinned it up into a bigger picture, which then is suitable for the archetype.
Right. And so I think that Harris is very clearly playing into these archetypes that we're reading about today, because she is very focused on not playing the seductress right now, if she ever has or does in her public life. I think she doesn't. But particularly since the election campaign began, we see her only in dark blue pantsuits, not never in a skirt. And so she's trying to make the feminine archetype not the issue. And if anything, to give the appearance of Sophia here in our election campaign. Whereas our former president is focused very heavily on masculinity and what the masculine side should want, the warrior should want, etc. And I just think that in the end, the feminine will win out this time. And that's my prognostication. And we need to remember that in the Red Book, Salome finally could see, and Trump, or I'm sorry, there's a Freudian slip. Jung was crucified. Okay, Jung was crucified in the Red Book for 3 days, and so I think these things wash over us like huge waves of the collective unconscious, huge waves. And I've been pretty astute over the years in predicting what will happen in a given situation.
I think
so I might be wrong. And Trump might pull some surprise out of his hat at the last moment. But I don't think so. Okay,
well, it's
so
interesting. It's interesting to me. The one thing that sticks out that I was appalled by is when Obama said, "Be a man and vote for a woman," and that's just affirmative action bullshit. And I don't want a woman or a man for a president. I want a leader. And so to me, that did a disservice to her because it pigeonholed her into gender. And then we get into the whole pronoun thing, which is destroying so much, which is just me, the virtue signaling cry for attention. But the be a man and vote for a woman, that's a high school pep rally, stir up the crowd with some invigoration statement rather than being a strong political, actionable thing to say about what she's doing. So I think that
So I concur with you on that point.
Yeah, and that's really
And
across both sides. That's the one
and
thing
and
that's stuck.
yet and yet somewhere in the spectrum of American maleness that will speak to some.
Oh,
Um,
certainly. And
and
unfortunately, the power of suggestion of it speaks to some. And I think that's a problem is we have a very suggestible society. We always have, we always will. I mean, there's
well, no, we won't always. Okay, we need to grow up as human beings. Okay,
true.
we're still in our adolescence, and it's time that we grow up and stop what began, you know, probably tens of thousands of years ago, where we were competing for territory. And so, the women were relegated to the women's tent, and the men were responsible for protecting them and protecting the their own society, right? And to the victor goes the spoils, and that's how our humanity has developed up until now. However, we've come to the end of it. Okay, we've come to the fact that we all live on this pale blue planet, hanging out there in space, and because of the population that exists in the world, we have to come to different approaches to these things. We can't just slosh back and forth fighting wars with one another because we have the power to destroy ourselves. We have one power, Iran, who's threatening a nuclear attack. And Putin was mentioning it. I think he backed off from it. And so we have got to back off from our ability to destroy one another, or we will destroy ourselves, very simply.
And I think
Um,
to drop back into your profit place there with that ability to destroy ourselves or not, if I look at it sociologically from a Cro-Magnon perspective versus a Neanderthal perspective, if I wandered into a Cro-Magnon camp 56,800 years ago, they would hand me something to eat and drink and want to know stories and tell me stories. If I wandered into a Neanderthal camp, I probably wouldn't wander in. I probably would be killed right at the outside of the camp just because you are not one of us. So we get the,
and
I
so
think,
and so I would just point out that we don't have either Cro-Magnon or Neanderthals any longer.
right,
Um,
we're a combination of both.
right.
And I think what's interesting is understanding strong enough to be gentle is Cro-Magnon, you know, assertive is Cro-Magnon, aggressive is Neanderthal. And
Mhm.
people start talking about toxic masculinity and alpha males and beta and all that stuff. Well, there's really something called a sigma, and that's strong enough to be gentle and fierce enough to be compassionate because you're actually unthreatened.
Yeah.
And it's not the bang in your chest, Neanderthal stuff. So I think that war of assertiveness versus aggression is, and as I guess James Hillman's book, Terrible Love of War, that kind of functions as a modus operandi of how are we fueling our actions? And if you feed the dark wolf or the light wolf, which one wins? Well, the one you feed. So I think that both is important to understand. Quick response Neanderthal, slow, calculated, methodical response Cro-Magnon. And
Yeah.
there's a need for both, but not a need for either only.
Yeah, sure. And too much of anything is too much.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Poison is too much of anything.
That's the lesson of yin and yang.
Yeah.
Okay, so reading on. So what I do want everyone to do is consider the archetypes that are playing out right now in the next 3 days and for the next year, let's say, or 5 years. And and see how these archetypes slosh back and forth in society in general. We need to start taking a collective unconscious view of the world. Okay, not only of our country, but of the world, and understand that these wars um, have essentially got to stop. I mean,
Well,
when
yeah,
I went to the National War College in the 1980s, at that time there was a war between Iran and Iraq. Okay, called the Iran-Iraq War. That lasted 8 years. Those two countries were fighting one another for 8 years. Um, and then it just sort of went away. It's incredible.
well, and
And
that's a Western notion too, because they've actually been fighting for 2,000 some years, and
yeah,
the 8 years was the one that our media latched onto for us to have us and them. And the only thing profitable is sick people and wars. Healthy people are not profitable. So, we have a power that be there of let's distract them with wars, basically bread and circuses. Let's give them bread and circuses. Let's just go back to that. And
mhm,
people who are unhealthy and brain fogged will take the bread, which turns right to sugar. They'll spike up and down. They'll be all over the place. And I really see this. America is the most unhealthy country on the planet now. Half of our foods are illegal in other countries. I mean, bread has 4 ingredients in Italy. Here,
mhm.
oh my Lord. And so 70% of people aged 17 to 22 are not eligible for the military due to obesity or mental conditions. And we're 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 really rotting out from inside. And I think there's a piece there that I notice a lot of youth that aren't that way. So look at the autism rates. So I really have jumped ship from politics to health, and I just look at the last 40 years in terms of what we've been told versus what is true, um, health wise. And I think that's a big component. It's not the only thing, but it's a big component of the ability to have a strong country.
Well, let's just be careful because uh, we have RFK Jr. running around saying similar things and saying that we should do without vaccines. Well, here's what I know. I know that my grandfather was engaged to a woman who, together with her four sisters, died on the same weekend from the Spanish flu in 1918. And therefore, he married my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
And so, therefore, I should be a fan of the flu because I exist because the flu existed and killed off the competition for my grandfather's life. And yet, um, the flu is no longer a scourge in the world, and COVID is still bad, but it's no longer the scourge it was 5 years ago. And um, and so I do think that we've made a lot of progress in modern medicine, and we can't just close our minds to that.
I'm
And
closing my mind. I'm glad you brought that up too, because for example, then forensically, the polio epidemic and the polio vaccine, if you look at when the polio vaccine dropped, herd immunity had gone down to 5% already, where the need for it was not so much attributed to the vaccine anymore. So there's a piece of the puzzle where part of what I just said there is untrue. And
so, what are you saying about polio now? I'm
if
not
you look
quite
at the
following you.
graph of if you look at the graph of when polio incidences were high, and then when the vaccine came out, they had already gone down to low. So herd immunity had, in a sense, jumped in. But what if the vaccine hadn't happened would it have spiked back up again? I don't know. So there's always
Well,
a
I can tell you that Israel and Palestine had a truce recently so that Palestinians could be vaccinated, okay, for polio. And I can tell
right. So
you
there you
that
go.
in my youth, when I was 12 years old, um, one of my good friends, and maybe I was even younger than this, maybe I was 10 or something, but a girl I knew, 12 years old, had polio.
Hmm.
And it was not a pretty thing. And
Oh,
it was a scourge in this country. And I don't know whether it resolved itself because of herd immunity or by vaccine, but I tell you, anytime somebody tells me to get a vaccine for polio, I take it because that girl's life was ruined at age 12.
well, I get,
And
and there was a boy who was my age when I was, I think, 7, right up the street, and he had the metal 2 crutches, that would go around the forearm, the little
right.
rings, and it was not a pretty sight. And I don't think he lived past 19. Um, but there's also, I think what I think is important here is, and this has been, I think, the most difficult piece. How can I desensationalize the things that most traumatize me? And I think what's interesting is I need to look at more facts. So, for example, RFK going this and that and the other, and well, he's all over corporate capture and suing big corporations. So that's his gig. But that's not the only gig. So I think you're right in that what it's important to me to see not both sides, to always see the third option, because I think I don't have a choice of one or the other. I need to make my own mind up. And I think,
Well, assuredly, we all have to make our minds up. Um, but I think we cannot ignore modern medicine and uh, the idea that RFK Jr. would be in charge of the Centers for Disease Control is just anathema to me. I can't imagine what the world would be like if we urge people because they're afraid of a shot
well, and
to
I think that's the,
not have their immunities.
well, I think
Uh,
there's a piece there that says, hey, you chicken, you chicken to take the shot. Well, I think what happens is it's not foregone conclusion that I should or shouldn't, where some people will ignore that and be just fine. But at the same time, I think if we talk about the medical profession, we need to talk about the health profession, because medicine has nothing to do with nutrition. I mean, if your doctor asks you your symptoms instead of asking you your diet, you have a pusher and not a doctor. And I think what's interesting is most things can be cured. I mean, I look at my life in the last year, 56 pounds in 7 weeks last November. I basically did everything that they said not to do. High animal fat diet. And I had my blood work done. Full metabolic panel, thyroid, picture of health with a high protein diet is all it said. So really what triggered this alopecia was probably the 56 pounds of weight loss last year. My thyroid probably finally kicked in and went, hey, what's going on? Big change. But now I'm not going to go ideology on health, but I think that the old quote of when we separate our philosophers from our warriors, we have cowards making laws and fools fighting our wars. I think when we separate health from medicine, that becomes a folly where, yeah, I don't want to, knock medicine down, but I do want to make a direct inclusion of health instead of sick people aren't profitable or healthy people aren't profitable. So, I mean, again, I just follow the money is where I,
well, no, I concur with that point. Okay, I'm going to get us back to the topic of the day, which is reading about the movements of the soul. And so I'm just hopeful that our listeners are thinking about this not only in their personal life, but in the big picture, and what is happening to us in society overall. And I think that these passages are extremely relevant to us right now. And obviously, the editors of this series believe that they're relevant right now. And so, and the whole purpose of what I do and have done for the last however many years, 8 years since I started this YouTube channel, has been to get people to think differently, okay, to think about not only their own life, but the life of our world, our society, of humanity itself, and how these things relate to those things. Because we have to remember that Jung, when asked what was his greatest discovery, he said the existence of the collective unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And probably there were intimations about the collective unconscious before Jung's time. I'm not saying he was the originator of the idea, but he certainly had archetypal experiences of a major variety that would send most people to the psychiatrist, which he was, that he had to deal with in his own life. Fortunately, he was a psychiatrist, so he could. And what I'm saying is 110 years on, we can look back and say, okay, we have a different, now thanks to Jung, have a different perspective on these things and should be thinking about what's happening in society at large, regardless of what political party and who you're going to vote for and all that
But I think
stuff.
that's an important point, because I think to that, and I hope the listeners can hear this fully, the unconscious is Jung's way of putting it. We've always known it before as flocking behavior, the herd. And what's interesting is, that whole image of the red umbrella going the different direction through the black umbrellas. And it's okay to be the red umbrella. You just don't need a thick skin. You just need to kind of, DGAF in a way, and have sovereignty. So I think there's a point where, when you feel outnumbered, I look at the old war movies where, we're surrounded. Oh, excellent! It's a target-rich environment. Fire at will. So, so that's the person who's like, nah, I'm not moved by what everyone else is moved by. And I think that brings in, with the unconscious, that power of whole body listening, where you need to be able to make that decision yourself and be informed by those around you. But also, I find I much rather surround myself with people who disagree and who are disagreeable, because they're, these cute curmudgeons. And what's cool is I can learn from them, but I can't really learn from people who agree with me all the time.
Yep. So it is
I mean, because
true.
makes a good. I mean, look at a military unit. Everyone has a mode. Everyone has a skill. Everyone has a similar set of skills, but then each person has something the other ones don't, and all together they make one total, regiment.
Yeah. So Richard asks a burning question, which anybody that knows anything about the Red Book will know the answer to. Richard asks, how did Jung deduce that it was the world's and not just his own? And the answer to that is completely discussed in the first chapter. In fact, the prologue chapter of the Red Book. And for those of you who don't know, Jung had 12 major dreams and visions that predicted World War I. And they were so horrible that he thought he might be losing it. But on August the 1st, 1914, when the Guns of August actually began, Trump was the happiest man in the world because
Young,
he knew
young.
that these experiences were experiences of the collective and not of him only.
And I think
And
that's an important notion of the whole idea of water conforms to its cup, where some people understand their environment more fully with a wider horizon than others.
right.
And
And so if anybody has any further question about that,
yeah, look at the dreams because that
look at the first couple of chapters of the Red Book, and you'll understand clearly why he was writing that, and why he made that
and
analysis.
and there's a lesson in that too of don't waste trouble in a crisis. Stay tuned because he could have, oh, I'm going crazy. I'm batty. I
Yeah,
need, and he didn't. He stayed with it, and I think out of that comes his quote. Do not ever accept a diagnosis from someone other than yourself. And
right. And in fairness, Trump's experiences were much more vivid than most people would have.
you mean Jung?
And I'm sorry, Jung's experiences were much more vivid. Another Freudian slip. Um, and we have to remember that about at least 80% of the Red Book was written in one 10-week period from Christmas Day, 1913, to about the middle of March, 1914. And that's where it is in the Black Books. And then Jung went back over a 16-year period and transcribed what had happened to him into the Red Book.
Right.
And he thought it was extremely important, and surely it was. Okay, so anyway. Okay, so I'm going to read on from page 220. Salome and Elijah appeared to Jung as companions. Thinking and feeling are two complementary functions. The feeling nature of inner feminine soul, providing a counterbalance to the logic of the outer-oriented masculine ego. The assumption of that time was that a man was more naturally oriented to logos, the spirit, and therefore was lesser natural aptitude for relatedness. Similarly, a woman was said to be naturally oriented to relatedness and more primitive in her animus, her logos function. Social constructs, particularly in relation to women, have changed greatly since Jung began elaborating these concepts in 1912. At the time in Switzerland, he would have observed that women did not often work or have an academic background. They were generally confined to the domestic sphere. Furthermore, having no equal rights in the running of their affairs or that of the world, they would be regarded as, and usually felt, dependent on a man for all other things. Now this has greatly changed with the advent of women's liberation, the right to vote, to study, and to work outside of the home, and with the modern climate of equality in the social arena. The social structure of the time mirrored an incomplete development of the anima, whereby women were kept in a demeaning and subservient role, yet their repressed power was greatly feared. Okay, and this is exactly what we're seeing in this year's election.
Yeah, and I really latch on to mirrored and incomplete development of the anima, and in plain English, that's terrified little boys in grown men's bodies. And if I look at the history of psychiatry in the late 1900s, women were diagnosed with hysteria.
Yeah.
And then, in the 70s, it started to be women were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, BPD, or bipolar. Well, if you look at 70% of those being women, and all of those being hysteria diagnoses for women, that's a code for we're diagnosing them for life, because that's simply menstruation. And when, sent off to the red tent and isolated, that's a lot of immaturity. Honestly,
Yeah.
that's a lot of, oh, well, this repressed power, well, the power to give life. And, men can give life, but they can't make life. So there's the create inception and make conception piece that I think what's interesting, that incomplete development of the anima. Yeah, well, an incomplete development of the ability to relate. And I think that's an us and them between genders back then.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's continued to this day. And
But fortunately, um, Mother Nature is imperious, as Edward Edinger reported.
it's true. Mother Nature will always balance the equation, and
Yep.
and so you got to be careful. It's kind of like climbing a mountain. Don't ever try to beat the mountain. Nature always wins.
Yeah.
You got to dance with it. So
Right. Okay, so it is also important for us to remember that the anima is an archetypal symbol, not a genetic or gender-related biological reality. Gender roles have changed greatly since Jung elaborated his theory, with his own fear and ambivalence of the inner feminine evident in these early dialogues with Soul in the Red Book. Today, these stereotypes would not apply to gender roles, as it is generally accepted that a man can have a developed eros function or a woman a well-differentiated logos function. A postmodern view could well be that we develop the contrasexual function according to our own psychology. Quote, the chapter Resolution contains this dialogue. Salome says, Mary was the mother of Christ. Do you understand? I see that a terrible and incomprehensible power forces me to imitate the Lord in his final torment. But how can I presume to call Mary my mother? Salome, you are Christ. I stand with outstretched arms like someone crucified, my body taut and horribly entwined by the serpent. You, Salome, say that I am Christ? It is as if I stood alone on a high mountain with stiff outstretched arms. The serpent squeezes my body in its terrible coils, and the blood streams from my body, spilling down the mountainside. Salome bends down to my feet and wraps her black hair around them. She lies thus for a long time. Then she cries, I see light. Truly, she sees her eyes are open. The serpent calls from my body. The serpent falls from my body and lies languidly on the ground. I stride over it and I kneel at the feet of the prophet, whose form shines like a flame. Unquote. The serpent, representing the opposition between good and evil, becomes ineffectual as a new consciousness takes form in Jung's psyche, and the anima, as symbolized by Eve and Salome, transforms further. When Salome says that Jung is Christ, his fear of madness increases. For identification with archetypal energies is a common sign of psychosis. We can also say that Salome evoked in him the numinosum, and she constellated the fear of evil that surrounds the repressed inferior function. In the text, he realizes that the power of these images and their autonomy, and comments, quote, "If you can overcome your fear of the unconscious and can let yourself go down, then these facts take on a life of their own. They form part of ancient mysteries," unquote. When the ego faces the dragon of the unconscious, the mythological terrible mother, and surrenders to the self, one becomes capable of a religious, connected attitude. With the anima as soul guide, mediator, and companion, mystical experiences of oneness become possible as the ego is strong enough to surrender to the depth and be impregnated by the generative imagery that emerges from the source. James Hillman writes, quote, "As mediatrix to the eternal unknowable, she is the bridge both over the river and into the trees and into the sludge and quicksand, making the known even more unknown," unquote. At the end of this scene, Jung understands that Salome is his sister and both are the children of Mary. Jung comments, quote, "Just as my thinking is the son of forethinking, so is my pleasure the daughter of love, of the innocent and conceiving mother of God. Forethinking is the procreative, love is the receptive." Okay, that's the end of Salome and Helen. We'll go on with Mary in a moment. Go ahead.
I think the fourth, that right there at the end, the word architecture comes to mind. Forethinking is the procreative, love is the receptive, where the word architecture in the classic Greek roots, as I probably beat this horse to death, but arche is to create, it's formless, it's inception, first spark, original idea. Techne is to make, to give form to the formless, to put together. Tarot would be magician, high priestess, but here forethinking is the procreative. So there's to create, the inception, the initial spark, and then love is the receptive, which is to relate and to make and give form to the formless. So I think it's a tidy quote line at the end of this chapter for Salome, where then Jung comes around to, oh, it's not his soul, it's his sister. And that's a, inner soul, inner sister. And I think that the both and comes to mind, but the architecne, the architecture to create and to make. And a lot of people think create and make are the same verb. And when you get down to distinctions like this, I think we have the both.
Okay, so going on, Mary. The mother of Christ is the archetypal feminine in its compassionate aspect that gave birth to the new God, Jesus, the light of consciousness, of conscious love in the world, is the Christ who brings the new covenant of brotherhood to our Western culture. Later, Jung wrote, "In Christian metaphor, Mary is the flower in which God lies hidden. Compassion is born with the Heavenly Mother, who knows and suffers the darkness of existence. She is receptive, suspends judgment, and accepts what is to come. Mary is the third development of the anima that is disclosed in spiritual growth, enabling a capacity for lasting relationships and a creative connection with the imaginal depths. The anima in a man can now love for its own sake, not for pleasure or gratification, and find value in feelings of closeness. Jung says, forethinking is singleness, love is for togetherness." Now I'm going to stop there for a minute and just talk about the way I have to look at my students, because I have a colleague who has been teaching at my
Oh, your video just froze.
acting up in class all the time, and the regular
Your
teachers.
your video froze right when you talked, right when you mentioned the the person teaching.
Person teaching.
You mentioned you said you have and you kind of stopped right there.
Okay, so mind you, the school where I work is an alternative school. It's a public school. However, it's the place where um, the worst behaved children in our community, many of whom have been traumatized by life, um, and acted out in class, so the regular teachers couldn't handle them anymore. They come to us, and officially I'm a special education teacher, but I went to a special education seminar for a couple of Saturdays, and what I found out is that normal special education teachers have certain tools that they can use, and it's only when those fail that they send them to us. And therefore, what I was learning in this particular seminar was totally useless. And we're at our own devices. So this colleague of mine told me that um, she's been teaching for a long time at this particular school, and that the result is that about 50% of our students are dead by the age of 25, about 50%. And so, and they're dead from drug overdoses, for fights in the community, from spousal struggles, what have you. All the many different things that can kill a person before they're 25. And so knowing that, and this is something that Donald Kalsched talked about in his book about trauma, um, knowing that we still have to go on, and we have to do our best for all the children in the school, um, in the hope that maybe we can beat that statistic back at some point. And so the result of this fact is that everybody in the school are the most empathetic teachers I have ever met. Okay, they're tough as nails in terms of the crap they take from children, but at the same time, they're extremely empathetic and are trying to help everyone succeed. And we hear all manner of things that about how we're hated or this or that, and yet we have to keep going in the face of that and do our best. And we have breakthroughs regularly, and very often we'll have children come to us for only 1/4 of the school year, and then they go back to their schools and their teachers find that they're changed.
But I
And
think your work is spoken directly to here with enabling a creative connection with the imaginal depths. And that's the only tool that's going to get them to live.
right.
I mean, you're teaching them to emerge from the womb of their trauma,
Right.
and to live regardless. And I think that's like you said, you went to this seminar, and it's useless because it's the normal school. You're at the advanced problematic place.
Yeah. We're, kids typically don't come to us unless they've been suspended a couple of times,
Well,
or
and I
their
keep in
their
the military.
mothers can't handle them.
Yeah, I mean, keeping the military analogies going, how does the person on point triage themselves? And you're
Yeah,
teaching them that.
right. And so anyway, we're trying to teach them togetherness and working together, because when they have fights in our school, they're fighting with their own community, typically. They're not fighting with us. They're fighting with their fellow students. And they shouldn't be doing that at all. If they have anybody that's opposing them, um, it surely isn't us, and it surely isn't their fellow students in our school. And so we have to teach them, knowing that we have to get them by this juncture in their lives. Okay,
But
so
really quickly, I think you remind me of the old African hunter's proverb: to go fast, go alone; to go far, go together.
yeah, and I find that many of the children, I mean, I've been asked by some of these children whether I ever owned slaves. Okay, whether I ever owned slaves. Okay, so God knows where they're getting that in their community, that there would be a possibility that I could have owned slaves in my lifetime. Um,
That
and
shows how closeted the history is, because even the amount of time understanding hundred over a double lifetime, uh, that how could that even be? I mean,
yeah,
so they don't have a perception of the past, and I think part of that is they probably don't teach history anymore.
well, we do teach it in Maryland. Okay, we do teach social studies in Maryland. It's a primary topic. It's one of the four primary topics, but I think that there are some states that have ridden social studies out of the curriculum, and
Yeah,
that's in public schools, and that's a huge problem.
it's a
Okay,
dangerous lack of context that
right.
their thinking is developed in.
And of course, there is a school of thought that thinks, well, we'll just create basically robots. We'll create people who aren't smart enough to think for themselves and can only operate a machine or pump gas or what have you. And
Right.
we'll give them
That's
sports.
called information.
Yeah, we'll give them sports to soak up their testosterone. Um, and
It's
and
indoctrination of bread and
then
circuses.
yeah, and then we can control the society. Well, that isn't the case, and we're seeing that on a regular basis in the United States.
Well, and I
Oh,
think that right there, I think you hit a point that I'd like to pull out of there is how much sports the circus is part of bread and circuses, and the beer and hot dogs are the bread. And how many people spectating life, how many people looking on rather
yeah.
than playing in their own field. And I think what's interesting about that, then, we celebrate our sports figures. Well, we're celebrating the circus. And I love sports like anyone else, but I don't worship them, and I certainly
Well,
don't
and
allow them to take place of my own actions in life.
yeah. Well, I do talk about an authentic life, and we all want to live an authentic life. But when you go to a sports stadium or arena, the only people that are having an authentic life in that place are the players on the field and the coaches.
Right.
The only people who are having an authentic life are the players on the field. Everybody else is having a vicarious life because they're asking those people to live in lieu of them. Um, and the issue is, this phrase had a certain je ne sais quoi at one point, get a life. Well, you have to get a life. You have to get an authentic life that um, is not being a spectator on life, but having a true life. When you have that, then you have an authentic life. Don't be a spectator. I mean, yeah, sure, I'm a spectator sometimes when very rarely I watch a Navy football game, almost never a professional football game. Um, and, for years I went seeing only one game a year, which was the Army Navy football game because I was brought up on it. But uh, this year, because I've been parking cars for my school, which is right outside the Navy Stadium in Annapolis, I have watched the Navy last season and this season pretty much every game until uh, God made his opinion known yesterday and rained it out at Rice for several hours so that they couldn't broadcast it. And finally, so I didn't stick with it, and Navy lost to Rice. Um, but anyway, such is life. And
Well, I think the whole get a life piece is important to notice. Um, don't buy advertising, don't buy marketing. For example, the bubonic plague killed so many people. Well, it didn't need any marketing. It's just people dropping dead of like flies around you.
yeah,
But if you look around and everything's fine, but all of a sudden there's this billboard telling you that things are happening, you know better. So I think be careful about marketing and advertising, because there's not just buy. There's also the messaging of how your life is fueled. And I think, again, be careful what media you consume.
right. Okay, so I'm going to read the last sentence once again, because it leads into the next paragraph. The anima in a man can now love for its own sake, not for pleasure or gratification, and find value in feelings of closeness. Jung says forethinking is singleness, love is togetherness. This development of the anima and the level of Mary takes place in the Red Book at the end of Liber Primus. In a scene titled The Sacrificial Murder, Jung is asked to eat the liver of an abused and murdered girl. Soul appears as an ageless, cloaked woman who tells Jung that he shares in the guilt of the child's untimely death and that the murdered girl needs atonement. She thus intimates that he must sacrifice the idea that he is not involved in the murder and needs to take responsibility for all the impulses he murdered in himself and in the world. Sacrifice is rooted in the idea of making sacred, and eating the liver symbolically brings a dimension of sacredness to Jung's relationship to mankind, both at inner and outer levels. Here, Soul teaches Jung that all humans share an individual responsibility for everything that happens in the collective, and each development of consciousness presupposes that we relinquish naivete and separateness. This ritual, like the symbolic eating of the flesh of Christ in the Mass, is a mystery that points to the ancient belief that we partake in the qualities of what we eat. By eating the child's liver, Jung himself became the murdered child. He symbolically absorbed and took into himself the qualities of the young feminine. Jung also described the liver as the seat of life, so we can infer that he is absorbing the very essence of life, oneness, in this ritual. Atonement and I'll read that the other way, at one-ment.
I was going to say, yeah.
Atonement consists in realizing that the brotherhood of all living beings, and if it opened Jung to the idea of the anima mundi, the world soul, and the flowering of the anima principle. Toward the end of the second part of the Red Book, Liber Secundus, Jung recognizes that all things are ultimately paradoxical. I love the beauty of the beautiful and the spirit of those rich in spirit, the strength of the strong. I laughed at the stupidity of the stupid. I despised the weakness of the weak. The meanness of the mean, and hated the badness of the bad. But now I must love the beauty of the ugly, the spirit of the foolish, and the strength of the weak. We must admire the stupidity of the clever, must respect the weakness of the strong, and the meanness of the generous, and honor the goodness of the bad. Where does that leave mockery, contempt, and hatred? Salome too reappears at the end of Liber Secundus and prompts a further development of anima. No longer blind, she now offers him her love, but Jung replies that he is already married. In other words, he takes her offer of love literally and not as an inner quality that can enhance his psychic life. He cannot yet see that she is really offering him joy. Quote, just as I achieved pleasure in myself and the power over myself, Salome had lost pleasure in herself, but learned love for the other. And Elijah had lost the power of his wisdom, but he had learned to recognize the spirit of the other. Salome thus lost the power of temptation and has become love. As I have one pleasure in myself, I also want love for myself. But that really would be too much and would bind me like an iron ring that would stifle me. I accept Salome as pleasure and and reject her as love, but she wants to be with me. How then should I also have love for myself? Love, I believe, belongs to others, but my love wants to be with me. I dread it, unquote. The scene further enables Jung to deepen his understanding of the feminine through his relationship to Salome. She is demanding an inner marriage. For that, he needs to open himself to the idea of self-love. Jung needs to be decapitated a third time to sacrifice further his thinking function so that freed from mental activity, he can dwell in the heart. The heart is the seat of true spirituality, a spirituality that knows that we are the only ones we can truly transform, that we are the ones who need help to develop the inner faculty of relatedness by relating to unhealed aspects of our psychology. This section ends with a further transformation of Salome, who asserts, I haven't cried anymore, for good fortune and bad fortune are balanced in me. His deep concern for Salome transforms their relationship, and she no longer demands attention in a blind and needy way. Jung is then told that he is Salome and that her well-being depends on his growth. You see, Salome is what you are. Fly, and she will grow wings. This interdependency between Salome and Jung points to an inner marriage between consciousness and unconscious, potentiality healing of the opposites in the psyche. The creative masculine and the sacred feminine can then work as partners on the journey to wholeness. Jung's journey into greater embodiment and integration of feeling continues in Scrutinies, the final section of the Red Book, where he is initiated into ancient Egyptian mysteries. He is presented with the symbol Hap, the flesh spirit, the blood spirit. He encounters an Isis-like goddess who appears with a red sun disk and wearing the song of her golden wings. She teaches him that the enlightening thought comes from the body, and she asks him to drink blood. Reclaiming the repressed son of the earth goes hand in hand with the redemption of the dark feminine and the shadow of the instinctual realm. Thus, she teaches him the value of a joy that comes from fulfillment and not from longing.
I think this is a great way to end that chapter part, because to be decapitated a third time, there's a reference there to Hermes Trismegistus, and Hermes is Mercury, which is thinking, air, consciousness, and the Trismegistus is the thrice born.
Mm-hmm.
So decapitated a third time is he's basically embodying Hermes Trismegistus as becoming the complete trinity of self, or Christ as self. Right. So Father, Son, and Sophia.
Yeah.
Holy Ghost not being Casper. It's feminine.
Okay.
Any comments on the YouTube?
Well, there's a discussion going on about Catholicism, which I'm going to leave to itself. I'm gonna leave those to themselves, because we have one more section of this, which is about 4 pages long, and I want to get through it so that we can talk about something else next week. So the next section is about Sophia. And remember that in the Bible, Sophia is a Greek word that is wisdom. And psychology, what is it? Not psychology. Anyway, in most Bibles, they've transformed the word Sophia to be feminine and changed it into a more masculine idea of wisdom, like wisdom from Elijah type stuff. And yet it was recognized long in the Old Testament in Proverbs. I think it's in Proverbs 8, 8 through 32, I think, are the verses, Proverbs 8, that Sophia is feminine and wisdom is feminine and comes from the feminine. And so we see, go ahead.
I was going to say, you're the person you had, I always forget her name, but she went through the etymology of going from Chokmah to Sophia to Pneuma to Logos to Spiritus Sanctus, where the divine feminine was basically removed and made divine masculine. And I think you're referring to that there, where
right, sure,
rather than psychology, the etymology. And she's a journalist, and what's her other? It's not ethnos. I'm losing a word too, but I remember that presentation that, you brought her on and she went through that whole
Yeah, and she
transformation.
pointed out that Russian Orthodox
Yeah.
Christianity and to an extent Greek Orthodox Christianity is feminine based, not masculine based.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so these ideas have been embedded so deeply into the psyche of the Western world, okay, of Western civilization. And we're only now coming out, well, trying to get into our late adolescence at least, and gaining the maturity to see that the feminine is important to all of us, and that um, the feminine does represent wisdom, and the feminine well, let's put it this way: when the masculine breaks the world, the feminine puts it back together. That's a fundamental way of looking at it. And so we saw this at the end of World War One, in particular, where 4 million young men on both sides of the war um, were killed, and yet a generation later there was a whole nother generation of young men that had to go back and repeat the battle until we finally got it. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson, with the Treaty of Versailles, and the I think Woodrow Wilson actually was on the right side of this, that the Treaty of Versailles should not be punitive, but the European powers, the British and the French and so on, were very adamant that there should be punitive measures in the Treaty of Versailles. And so the result of that decision basically created Hitler, because it impoverished the Germans for the next uh, decade at least after World War One very terribly. And so when the next generation emerged in Germany, they were quite resentful, and
Mhm.
they wanted to change things. Okay.
Yeah.
And Hitler used to mention in his speeches the Diktat of Versailles, um, as something that was to be hated, and because it caused these, um, you know, it basically did what our former president wants to do, which was to get back at everybody. And the answer can't be that. And we learned our lesson in by the end of World War II, so that what we did after World War II was not punish the Japanese and the Germans, but actually help them to rebuild with the Marshall Plan.
Mm.
And so the result of that um, is that Japan and Germany are our staunchest allies, absolutely the staunchest allies in the world of the United States. And because the later generations know that we weren't punitive after World War II.
And I
And,
think those two are great examples about how to best handle post-war situations. But
sure.
the Marshall Plan then is an economic plan for money to be poured to enhance both economies. So it's kind of, to me, like going to wait to get a massage until you feel horrible. Well, that's like after war. But if you go and keep the peace and enhance the nourishment of the health of both countries, that's like going to get a massage when you feel really good. So, we have to be careful. The whole terrible love of war, these
Mhm.
constant, the perpetual wars, they're great for business, death and taxes, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting to me that follow the money, and the thing is too, it's just like, bringing more countries into NATO, and then those countries have to comply to the NATO standards, and then they have to
Right.
update their military, and then it's business, business, business. And so I'm not gonna go against money. I mean, I
Yeah.
that would be hypocritical, but I think that there's a point where health is sacrificed for um, death, frankly.
Yeah. I'm not going to undertake the Middle Eastern comments at the moment, um, because they're too raw, and
Yeah.
they're simply too raw. And what is needed in the Middle East is peace. And once there's peace, then the place needs to be rebuilt. And especially Gaza has to be rebuilt. And so to the extent that it's punitive, as which is our former president's instinct and Netanyahu's instinct, um, that is not going to work. And there will be generations of warrior Palestinians if that's what they intend to do. But if there's peace and rebuilding and mutual trust in the form of uh, a country of their own for the Palestinians, uh, then maybe we can resolve most of the disputes in the Middle East that we are worried about. Obviously, it does not solve the major rift in Islam itself between Sunnis and Shia, but that also needs to be addressed in a similar way.
And I
And
think it's a good comment that it's still too raw, but I think too that, I mean, that's important. It's still too raw, so people don't jump on reacting to make a comment. I think that's an important mediation to take to heart when you're looking at things, because if you look at this, the difference between one-sided fanaticism versus wonderfully healthy, developed identity. So, I mean, there's a dignity and difference with identity, whereas you get fanaticism and fundamentalism, the fundamentals are usually pretty flawed.
yeah. Okay, so now we're going to go on with Sophia and Trey and go for the gold here. I'll read as long as my voice holds out, and then maybe Jordan can back me up here. So at the beginning of the Red Book, we are told that in the Black Books, Jung had commented thus on soul, quote, when the above and the below are not united, she falls into three parts: a serpent, the human soul, and the bird of heavenly soul, which visits the gods. In scrutinies, soul announces that she has returned from above, thus appeared as Sophia, the celestial daughter and the wisdom side of God, the God archetype. In this ultimate stage of anima development, no human face can adequately contain the image of woman. Quote, when I looked up again, I saw my soul in the upper realms, hovering irradiated by the distant brilliance that streams from the Godhead, unquote. Wisdom is the awareness that soul encompasses the whole of life. This development of compassion and wisdom is not one that is often visible in today's world, as few can claim this level of consciousness. With Sophia constellated in the psyche, the animus compassion has the differentiated attunement of wisdom. Wisdom is expressed in compassion. She connects us with immanence, which is the goal of individuation and the source of all love. Quality at that level can only be described through paradox and poetry. Quote, with the attainment of this goal, it becomes possible to disengage this ego from all its entanglements with collectivity and the collective unconscious. Through this process, the anima forfeits the demonic power of an autonomous complex. She can no longer exercise the power of possession since she is depotentiated. She is no longer the guardian of treasures unknown, no longer Kundry, demonic messenger of the Grail, half divine and half animal. No longer is the soul to be called mistress, but a psychological function of an intuitive nature, akin to what the primitives mean when they say, quote, he has gone into the forest to talk with the spirits, or my snake spoke with me, or in the mythological language of infancy, a little bird told me, unquote. This is a return to simplicity, to the child whose curiosity and openness color all she encounters. The child archetype expresses the birth of a new awareness, of a new God, who appears in the Red Book at the end of Liber Primus as Faunus. With the return of soul, Jung now sees soul in nature and the sparkling, animating light that permeates all things. But he is troubled, for he does not see this happening in the hearts of men and asks for her collaboration to change this. He urges her to work for the salvation of man. Quote, I demand that you do this for the earthly fortunes of humankind, unquote. The cooperation between soul and man, between conscious and unconscious, is one of the most solid tenets of Jung's psychology. To keep the balance and dialogue between inner and outer life is essential in his worldview. The transformation of anima is neither linear nor achieved once and for all. It is holographic and multidimensional. As shadow is deep and never conquered, man moves from one aspect of anima to another at different moments of life. Complexes will emerge and force one in and out of consciousness and offer opportunities for further development. The path of individuation developed in the Red Book describes one man's world, and the injunction is to take on the task of self-knowledge personally and deeply, thereby increasing compassion and wisdom in the world. Quote, I give you news of the way of this man, but not of your own way. My path is not your path. Therefore, I cannot teach you. The way is within us. Within us is the way, the truth, and the life. So live yourselves, unquote. Soul, in her Sophia aspect, finally emphasizes her connection to nature. Touch the earth, press your hand into matter, shape it with care. This implies taking responsibilities for what we love. Unlike the paradigm described in Genesis 1, where man is given power over all living things, Soul asks him to embrace an ecological relationship to nature. Man's patriarchal attitude of power over the earth and the animals is an unsustainable and as pathological intracyclically as it is for the world. Atonement is needed at all levels, as all life forms share the same essential essence. The slaughterhouses that feed the world with battery chickens, pork, beef, and lamb bred in mechanistic warehouses, devoid of all the basic necessities, show the autistic relationship we have with nature. The same insensitivity is applied to alien economic or political refugees, as well as to the more vulnerable parts of our own nature. Bombarded with judgments and criticisms, symptoms in the body echo the world's grief and difficulty with symbolic awareness. In his conversation with Elijah, another character in the Red Book, Jung is told that he cannot extricate himself from his law of his own nature. This idea is taken up again later when Jung states that, quote, the development of the personality means fidelity to the law of one's being, unquote. It takes a very differentiated listening to attune to the spontaneous flow that runs through us. It may demand that we not follow social conventions of food, drink, or conversation. Individuation is the road away from collective pressures and demands an attuned ear to match the rhythms of our outer lives with that of our personal fate. The heroic and tyrannical ego, capable of the destruction of life on a grand scale, is incapable of perceiving the soul shining through all manifestations of life. As Philemon teaches, quote, these dead have given names to all beings, the beings in the air, on the earth, and in the water. They have waited and counted things. What did they do with the admirable tree? What happened to the sacred frog? Did they see his golden eye? Did they do penance for the sacred ore that they dug up from the belly of the earth? No, they named, weighed, numbered, and apportioned all things. They did whatever pleased them, yet the time has come when things speak, unquote. Sophia leads man to the anima mundi, the functioning and landscapes of world soul, insofar as we dwell in soul and not that soul dwells in us. The anima mundi is the intelligence that resonates in all things, the vital force that contains us. We do not have a soul. We live in soul and are enlivened by her. The primary tensions of psychodynamics are now resolved. Thinking is no longer polarized and divisive. It becomes a practical tool twined with subtle intuitive certainties. The original unconscious ego, locked in aerobic fusion with the Great Mother, has reached a stage of consciousness aware of the unity of all things. Now consciousness dwells in soul, in wholeness. The I, the ego, is no longer experienced as separate, but as an expression of interbeing. This new cosmic consciousness obliterates differences between soul and external things. Inner and outer worlds are both real, forming a continuum between the lightness of air and the density of matter, all expressions of oneness. The world soul, Sophia, is a woman whose visible form becomes the universe, the prairies and the sky, the hollow of the neck and the curvature of the spine. Image, metaphor, and symbol emerge, bridging and uniting all aspects of experience. Feeling and wonder at the mystery embedded in all things nourish the imagination. Insight now finds best expression in paradox and poetry. Quantum mechanics is infused with it. What is the matter? It is light, Is it light? Is it wave? The imagination will take us to new wonderful descriptions of the world. Yet a deep ecology of soul maintains relationship to body, to nature, to inner images, forming and dissolving our understanding of reality. The wings of spirit travel through the dark earth and deepen the sacred connection to life, re-envisioning time and space and generating non-local, atemporal, awe-inspiring experiences. And yet, before enlightenment, chop wood, work, sleep. After enlightenment, chop wood, work, sleep. Following the path of individuation is for the few and demands that the individual produce values that compensate for his absence from society. In Jungian psychology, nothing is truly developed until it is manifested in the world. Who we are and what we do become coherent and congruent. We no longer have soul, we dwell in her. Then everything that we encounter through the life takes on a new dignity, a new sacredness, and this shows itself in the presence we bring to life, to others, in the choices we make and the values we uphold. The anima mundi is the innermost point, and at the same time, the encompasser of the world. The more conscious we are, the more ethical we become. This new sense of responsibility for all aspects of life is visible in increasing ecological awareness and the care we show in all our encounters. This is a difficult task as there is no guidebook to follow, each situation demanding an immediate feeling response infused with experience and spontaneity. For this, we need to maintain a humble approach. The root of the word is humus, which means soil, the earth, and know that for all that we know, just as much as is unknown. End of message.
I think
Jordan.
the simple across this whole piece is stated when she writes, sacrifice is to make sacred. The base of sacrifice is to make sacred, which says continually live in the confluence of the past and the future, memories and dreams. That is the perpetual present. So I think sacrifice, to make sacred, means see things as they are and be aware and context, and don't hold on to false edifices. I mean, things that are past, things that are gone.
Yep.
And I really love the hope in this statement. The more conscious we are, the more ethical we become. I hope to see that.
Oh yeah. And so if you're going along with a crowd, you're not individuating. It's as simple as that.
Well, it's like Mark Twain said, if I ever find myself in the middle of the mainstream, I need to pause and figure out where the hell I went wrong.
Right. And so next, next Wednesday, my birthday gift to my 21-year-old grandson will arrive, and I'm going to show this. I'm going to show you it unfinished since I don't have a good picture of it finished, which is a heck of a shame because it's an interesting painting. But I want to show you because I want to tell you more or less what I said to him about it. Okay, so this piece ultimately is called The Magician, and you can see the magician at the center of the piece. And so what we know about the type of work we do, with Colleen Kibert, who studied Jungian psychology with art for decades and decades. She says that the lower left is the creative wellspring, and the upper left is dreams and visions. And the lower right is wisdom. The upper right is your mission and hope for the future. And so that means that the left half is the past and the right half is the future. And the magician sits at the intersection of the past and the future and creates the future. The magician creates the future. Okay, that's the significance of this. Okay, and the magician at the center is the self. It's you, yourself, with a capital S, yourself. Each of us is creating the future. It's not up to some president. It's not up to whether our country is stronger than any other country. Whatever it is, we create the future. Okay. And if you want a good life, you have to have that perspective that you are creating the future. You are
And I love
creating the life in which you will live.
the magician inhabiting that center piece that's, has the quaternity of a piece of each of the four quadrants. But then to me, past is memory, future is dream, and they both confluence like rivers into the perpetual present. So the power of now is not constrained by the past, not made anxious by the future, but directing, which of those dreams flow in, turn towards them and nourish the present. But that magician there, inception, first spark, the place of right now, always. And
Right.
that's an important message.
And so, whatever you do, wherever you are, whether you're in prison or wherever it is, you're individuating when you're creating your own future, whatever that is possible. I mean, you could be in prison for life and know that you'll never get out. And okay, if society has made a decision that you're never going to be released from prison, then it's best to figure out what you're going to do with the rest of your life. And there are many examples of that. There's a movie about it called The Birdman of Alcatraz. And and many stories about it. But in the end, we're all prisoners. We're all prisoners in our own psyches, and we have to look to our self within our psyches to know how we're going to live in the future. And I don't mean just survive, but I mean
Thrive.
Pardon?
Thrive. Yeah, instead of
Thrive.
survival,
Yeah.
it's thrival.
How are we going to thrive given the life that we have? Okay, because we only get it once, and it has a middle and it ends. And so if you want to understand individuation, then you have to understand that it's you that is going to create that future. It isn't me. I tell my students, it isn't me. I'm not doing what I'm doing in the school for me, because my life is almost over. I'm 78 years old. My father died at 83. And so I have, a limited expectation of the future of my life, probably not more than 22 years, so, give or take. And so but my progeny, my grandchildren have to live in the world that not only they, but all of my students create. Okay. That's the point.
When I
We
love
had,
we only live once, and I always love to respond, no, we only die once. We live every day in a perfect scenario, and it's the same thing, but make it count and um, just make it count.
well, and I do believe in immortality and rebirth, but I believe in it in a different way than most people think. And that is that, my immortality carries down the centuries in ways that I can't even say. Okay. I know that I have about 20,000 followers on this YouTube channel, and they've been listening to our videos for nearly a decade now. And all of them that have listened more than a few seconds um, have been changed in some way. Okay. You're also changed if you watch Jordan Peterson or our former president, for example. Okay, either positively or negatively, you can take it or leave it. But the point is that all of us may have to make our own judgments
And
and stop letting other people make decisions for us.
but I think Jordan Peterson is really the beautiful poster child of do not back down, because the Canadian government trying to strip him of his psychiatric license, trying to cancel him, all kinds of things because he's telling the truth, and he's telling it wisely and actively and not being timid. And he kind of reminds me of Oscar Wilde, who said, well, tell them the truth, but make them laugh, otherwise they will try to kill you. So I mean, it's like he's
Yeah, they will kill you.
yeah, and that's I think what that's it's such a shame. um Basically, if you don't make theater, then you're 86th. So he's been through a lot. I remember how much I disrespected him, and then I found out all of his addictions and such, and then what he did. And you talk about pulling yourself out of hell. And he and then his daughter and his wife. I mean, they're a trinity of strong people, and
Very definitely.
they're
Very,
very
very
much,
definitely.
to me, they're wonderful mentor idols for people to look to for how to be authoritative. And he's assertive, not aggressive. And I think that he really is living his life now as a complete um, integral part of what it means to do that.
Yeah. And he has a different view from the view I have about our former president. And the only thing I can say is that if you've spent time with me hearing my opinions or Jordan, then go hear Jordan Peterson and make your own judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Jordan Peterson looks at it a somewhat different way. He looks at it based on this big five personality traits. And
Yeah, the
he's
well-developed 13-year-old adolescent kind of thing.
right.
I think that's what he said.
Yeah.
That made it into a professional level.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So, as long as we're talking about retribution and paying off uh, debts, if you win, then you're talking about the Diktat of Versailles. Okay. Then you're not talking about something that's better for society. Okay, we need to figure out how we can have the Marshall Plan with our fellow men.
Without having to have the war first.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think the whole, and honestly, if they want to play the greed game, how much more can be made by taking a big system and making it bigger instead of having to, carve out, crash it, which is basically a giant ATM machine, honestly. So for larger scale fish.
Yeah. And so my purpose here in all of these years of making this channel available has only been to make this information available to a wider audience around the world. And that's been largely achieved because there are plenty of people that watch these videos who live outside the U.S., live outside the Western world, don't have access to these books, either because they can't afford them or they don't have access to them at all. And in the end, we all have to make our own judgments based on our own
Yep.
wisdom. And, so I've given my prediction, my prophecy for the election, but I'm not going to urge you on how to vote. Okay. Everybody has to make their own judgment.
Yeah, definitely.
And
And I really appreciate that message more than anything else because it puts the onus of responsibility on not being able to blame anybody afterwards.
yeah,
You, you need, and that's the thing, make shame walk the plank. You don't even need blame anymore. You have listening, responsibility. And I think that's important because we're moving forward and it's always treacherous times. I mean, it's always, you can make it into a crisis, but I don't like to crisis monger. I think that's nipping on the poison teat of which media piece really got the hair on the back of my neck up. I mean,
right. And so one thing I mean, we've batted around this idea of individuation for about a decade now. I mean, obviously it's been in Jungian psychology for a century, but it's been widely known, let's say, on the internet for the last decade or so. Um, and what you can say is if you're following someone else's opinion, you're not individuating. Very simply.
yeah,
If you're going to vote for whoever, and this means at every level of the electorate, and you're doing it because somebody else is doing it, you're not individuating, and
yeah.
you have not understood Jung's message. Okay, very simply.
He didn't even let himself get bullied by himself. The
Yeah,
war one dreams, and I think that's important. A lot of people say, "Well, but people won't like me." I don't find that to be reasonable.
yeah,
If some people don't, if there are some people who don't like me, if there aren't some people that don't like me, then I'm not doing my job
yep,
because
that's right.
there's got to be some kind of graded edge. And honestly, Middle East, it's got to speak. New things have to be raw. So they
Yeah,
start. I mean, make an omelet.
right. And my kids are always talking about people who are snitches, and a couple of them have concluded that I'm a snitch, me. Okay. And I say, well, I'm calling them on their misbehavior, of course, and I'm keeping data during my daily life about their misbehavior. And so they call me a snitch, and I say, "Yep, that's my job. That's my role here.
Well,
I'm the snitch that's trying to get you to realize that this isn't the way to go."
and I love when people say something like that or they call me some name, like, oh wow, I've been called worse. So keep trying.
Amen.
You're not on my roster. You got to try
Yeah,
harder.
yeah. Okay, I'm gonna let you go. I've got to go get my hair cut, and
All
I'll
right.
see y'all next week, or on Wednesday, I guess just for grins, I'm going to stay online just for a moment more so that I can put the link for our signups here. So we never charge anything for what we're saying here. And so you don't have to fear that. And if you want to get notices about our events and you want to participate in our panel, then you should go to this link, which I'm putting in the chat, so that if you go to those radio buttons and put it in, if you select one of those things, you'll get notified for that thing.
Oh, video froze.
Eastern time, and Wednesday afternoons at 5 p.m. for our advanced reading group. So if you wish to join either of those, please come to that link, which I've just given you, and sign up for it so that you'll have notice of that. I'm trying to send the notice out every week so that everybody has it, but you have to sign up on that page in order to get the notice. That's the only thing. Okay, so peace, everyone. Have a good week, and God bless the United States of America. The world will not end regardless of the results of the election. So peace.